It's the most humiliating ordeal of my life. This is what I have to endure to prove my innocence. Don't treat me like a criminal, because I am innocent.
He was called the King of Pop. He was called a genius. He was called untouchable. But behind the sequined glove and the moonwalk that changed music forever, there was a man quietly falling apart, and almost nobody around him was willing to admit it. What happened inside that rented mansion on Carolwood Drive in the final hours of June 25, 2009, would end up shocking the entire planet, and even now, more than a decade later, people are still trying to understand exactly how it happened. So today, we are going back. Back to the last rehearsal. Back to the last night. Back to the moments nobody was supposed to see. Let's start at the very end of his career, not the end of his life, because those two endings did not happen on the same day, even though it feels that way. On the night of June 24, 2009, Michael Jackson walked onto a stage inside the Staples Center in Los Angeles for what would become his final rehearsal. He was preparing for This Is It, the comeback residency that was supposed to prove to the world, and maybe to himself, that he still had it. 50 sold-out shows in London were waiting for him. Millions of dollars were riding on his shoulders. And that night, according to people who were standing just a few feet away from him, he gave everything he had left. Witnesses in the room said his performance of Earth Song that night felt different. Not like a rehearsal. Not like a man simply going through the motions before a big tour. It felt like something deeper, almost like he was performing for his life rather than for an audience. Choreographers, dancers, and crew members who had worked with him for years later admitted they had never seen him pour that much emotion into a run-through before. Some of them even said it gave them chills, the kind of feeling you get when you sense something is not quite right, even if you can't explain why. Just after midnight, the rehearsal wrapped up. Michael hugged his director, thanked the team, and told them he would see them again in a few hours to keep working. He seemed tired, but hopeful. Nobody in that building that night believed they had just watched his last performance. Nobody could have known. To understand why that night mattered so much to him, you have to understand what was riding on this comeback. Michael Jackson hadn't toured in over a decade. His public image had been dragged through years of legal battles, tabloid headlines, and financial trouble. He owed money. He had something to prove, not just to concert promoters or record labels, but to himself and to a public that had spent years questioning who he really was. This wasn't just a tour. It was supposed to be redemption. 50 nights in London, sold out almost instantly, tickets vanishing within hours of going on sale. The pressure on one man's shoulders to deliver something spectacular, night after night, at 50 years old, after everything he had already been through, was almost unimaginable. People who worked closely with him during rehearsals later described a man determined not to disappoint anyone. He wasn't coasting through choreography. He was relearning his own body, pushing through exhaustion, trying to recapture a level of physical precision that had once come to him almost effortlessly as a younger performer. Some nights he looked strong. Other nights, according to crew members, he looked visibly depleted, running on adrenaline and willpower rather than actual rest. And underneath all of it, hidden from almost everyone except the people closest to him, was a sleep problem that had quietly spiraled out of control. He was driven back to the rented house in Holmby Hills, a quiet, gated neighborhood where the outside world felt very far away. But inside those walls, something had been building for weeks, something that had nothing to do with dance routines or stage lighting. Michael Jackson could not sleep. Not for one night. Not for two. According to people close to him at the time, his insomnia had stretched on for weeks, maybe even months, and it had gotten so severe that ordinary methods of falling asleep simply stopped working on him. This is the part of the story that most people never fully understood until the trial years later. Michael wasn't just tired the way anyone gets tired before a big show. His body had, in some ways, forgotten how to shut down naturally. And the man responsible for helping him sleep during those final weeks was his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, a cardiologist who had been hired specifically to travel with him during the tour preparations. What played out inside that bedroom on the night of June 24th into the early morning of June 25th has since been pieced together through court testimony, medical records, and a criminal trial that captivated the world. And it paints a picture that is honestly hard to sit with. Just after 1 in the morning, Dr. Murray reportedly gave Michael a dose of Valium, hoping it would ease him into sleep. It didn't work. Over the following hours, additional sedatives were introduced, one after another, medications typically used to treat severe anxiety and sleep disorders. Each dose was meant to finally bring rest. Each one failed. By 7:30 in the morning, after roughly 6 hours of escalating sedation, Michael Jackson was still fully awake. Think about that for a moment. 6 hours. Multiple powerful medications. And still, no sleep. For a man who had a major rehearsal ahead of him and immense pressure resting on his shoulders, that kind of prolonged, drug-resistant insomnia must have been terrifying, both physically and mentally. Sleep specialists who reviewed the case afterward pointed out something disturbing. Benzodiazepines like the ones being used that night are not supposed to be stacked on top of one another this way, especially not repeatedly, night after night, for weeks on end. Tolerance builds quickly. The body starts requiring more and more of the drug just to achieve the same effect, while the actual quality of rest keeps declining. Some medical professionals who later examined his history suggested Michael may have gone without a full, natural night's sleep for as long as 2 months leading up to his death. 2 months. Imagine trying to function, let alone rehearse elaborate choreography in front of a demanding production team, on that kind of prolonged sleep deprivation. It also helps explain why he had become so fixated on the one substance that reliably knocked him out, even though it was never meant for this purpose. Propofol doesn't produce real sleep. It produces something closer to a medically induced coma, a total shutdown of consciousness with none of the restorative brain activity that actual sleep provides. In hospitals, patients under its effects are watched every second by trained staff with equipment built specifically to catch any sign of trouble immediately. At home, in a bedroom, none of those safeguards existed. By mid-morning, with nothing else working, Michael reportedly asked for the one thing he had come to rely on above everything else. He called it his milk. In reality, it was Propofol, a powerful anesthetic normally reserved for hospital operating rooms, where patients are placed under general anesthesia for surgery and monitored constantly by trained anesthesiologists using specialized equipment. It is not a sleep aid. It was never meant to be used this way, in a bedroom, without the machines that track heart rate, oxygen levels, and breathing. According to trial testimony, around 10:40 that morning, Dr. Murray administered a dose of Propofol through and 4-line. To reduce the burning sensation the drug can cause when injected, it was mixed with a local anesthetic. Slowly, finally, Michael appeared to drift off. And for a brief window of time, everything seemed calm. But it wasn't calm. It was the opposite of calm. It was the most dangerous moment of the entire ordeal, unfolding quietly, without alarms, without warning signs that anyone in that room was equipped to catch in time. This is where the timeline becomes genuinely disturbing, because according to Dr. Murray's own account, given later to detectives and in court, he left the room. He has said he stepped away briefly to attend to a few personal matters, believing his patient was finally resting peacefully. There was no pulse oximeter clipped to Michael's finger. No monitor tracking his oxygen saturation. No one watching to see if his chest was still rising and falling. A man who had just been given a surgical-grade anesthetic, alone, unmonitored, in a private bedroom. Nobody knows the exact number of minutes that passed. Some estimates from the trial suggest it may have been more than just a few minutes, possibly much longer. But when Dr. Murray returned to check on him, Michael Jackson was not breathing. Try to imagine that moment. The panic. The realization that something has gone catastrophically wrong. CPR reportedly began right there in the bedroom, and according to testimony, it was performed with Michael still on the mattress rather than on a hard, flat surface, which medical experts have since pointed out is far less effective for chest compressions. Every second mattered, and yet even something as basic as the surface beneath him may have worked against any chance of recovery. There was also, according to later investigations, a troubling delay before anyone called for outside help. Whether it was confusion about the exact address, difficulty locating a phone, or simple panic freezing everyone in place, precious minutes ticked by. It wasn't until a member of Michael's security team finally placed the emergency call that paramedics were properly alerted, at 12:21 in the afternoon. When paramedics arrived at the estate just a few minutes later, they found a man already in cardiac arrest. No pulse. No breathing on his own. They immediately began advanced life support measures, working on him right there in the house for what would stretch into more than 40 continuous minutes. Chest compressions. Airway management. Every tool available to bring him back. Still nothing. Eventually, the decision was made to transport him. He was placed on a stretcher and rushed by ambulance to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, one of the top hospitals in the region. Doctors and nurses inside the emergency room continued the fight the moment he arrived, doing everything medically possible to restart his heart and stabilize him. But his body simply would not respond. Medical records from that day describe just how aggressive those final resuscitation efforts really were. Prolonged chest compressions, sustained over such a long stretch of time, are physically forceful enough that they can fracture ribs, and the autopsy later confirmed exactly that. Several of his ribs had been broken, not from any prior injury, but from the sheer intensity of the emergency teams trying everything in their power to bring him back. One of the paramedics who treated him at the scene later testified that by the time help arrived, his skin already felt cool to the touch and his eyes were dry, small but significant clues suggesting that more time had passed since he stopped breathing than anyone in the house had initially accounted for. It was a grim detail, but an important one, because it helped investigators understand that the window for saving him may have already closed long before paramedics ever walked through the door. At 2:26 in the afternoon on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was officially pronounced dead. Within minutes, the news began leaking out, and what happened next online was almost as historic as the loss itself. A celebrity news outlet broke the story first, reportedly just 18 minutes after his official time of death. From there, it spread faster than any traditional news organization could keep pace with. Major networks scrambled to verify the report before broadcasting it, terrified of getting something this enormous wrong. Meanwhile, ordinary people flooded search engines and social platforms so heavily and so suddenly that some technology companies briefly mistook the surge in traffic for a coordinated cyber attack rather than a global outpouring of shock and grief. Fans gathered outside the hospital within the hour, many of them in disbelief, holding on to hope that somehow this was a mistake, that their idol would walk out and prove the rumors wrong. He didn't. And the world had to slowly come to terms with the fact that the king of pop, a man who had shaped the sound and culture of generations, was truly gone at just 50 years old. Radio stations across the world dropped their regular programming that afternoon and played nothing but his music for hours. Television networks interrupted scheduled broadcasts to bring live coverage from outside the hospital and later from outside his family's home. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes piled up outside Neverland Ranch and outside recording studios where he had once worked, left by strangers who had never met him but who felt, in some very real way, like they had lost someone close to them. For an entire generation that grew up with his music playing in the background of their lives, this wasn't just celebrity news. It felt personal. But the story didn't end there. In many ways, it was only beginning, because now investigators had to figure out exactly what had happened inside that house, and why. The full autopsy revealed details that painted a far more complicated picture than the public first assumed. Contrary to early rumors that Michael was dangerously underweight and frail, the report showed he stood at 5'9" and weighed around 136 pounds. Thin, yes, but not the skeletal image many tabloids had rushed to publish. What the coroner did find, however, was deeply telling. More than 50 needle marks scattered across his arms, hips, thighs, and shoulders, evidence not of casual drug use, but of a body that had been subjected to injection after injection over the years, likely tied to chronic pain and sleep issues stemming back decades, including complications from a stage accident in the 1980s that left him relying on pain management for years afterward. Doctors also discovered signs of degenerative arthritis affecting his lower spine and finger joints, a strange and almost heartbreaking detail when you consider how physically demanding his career was, how many nights he was expected to dance and perform at a superhuman level while quietly dealing with pain most of his fans never knew about. There was evidence of a urinary catheter and a distended bladder, consistent with someone who had been so heavily sedated for extended periods that his body could no longer function or wake up on its own. The autopsy also uncovered something that surprised many people who assumed his heart was the weak point. Medical examiners found his heart to be in reasonably healthy condition. What they found instead were signs of underlying respiratory trouble, including inflammation in the small airways of his lungs and a condition affecting the tissue between the air sacs, both of which can quietly reduce how efficiently oxygen moves through the body. On their own, these issues might never have been noticed in daily life. But combine them with a body running on almost no real sleep for weeks, and then add a powerful anesthetic suppressing his breathing on top of that, and you start to see how multiple smaller vulnerabilities lined up in exactly the wrong way, at exactly the wrong moment. Investigators also confirmed something that had been whispered about and mocked in tabloids for years. Michael Jackson had vitiligo, a real, progressive skin condition that causes patches of skin to lose their natural pigment. The autopsy documented extensive depigmentation across his chest, face, arms, and abdomen, along with the use of a specific bleaching cream that dermatologists sometimes prescribe once vitiligo has spread too far for even repigmentation treatments to help. In other words, a medical condition that the public spent decades turning into a punchline was, in fact, exactly what he and his doctors had said it was all along. Toxicology results eventually confirmed what many suspected. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled his death a homicide, caused by acute propofol intoxication, with additional sedatives found in his system as well, including the same benzodiazepine-class drugs that had been used earlier that night in the failed attempt to help him sleep. The propofol levels detected were consistent with doses used to maintain general anesthesia in a hospital operating room, not anything close to safe for unsupervised home use. Without proper monitoring equipment in place, without an anesthesiologist trained to watch every heartbeat, his breathing was suppressed until it stopped altogether. 2 years later, in 2011, the case against Dr. Conrad Murray went to trial. Prosecutors laid out a timeline built from phone records, witness statements, and medical evidence, arguing that his actions amounted to gross negligence. Medical experts took the stand one after another, describing how far outside acceptable practice it was to administer propofol outside of a hospital setting, with no EKG, no pulse oximeter, and no continuous monitoring of any kind. The defense pushed back, suggesting Michael may have administered additional medication to himself during a moment when he was left alone, but forensic specialists testified that this explanation did not hold up against the physical evidence. In the end, the jury reached its verdict. Conrad Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He lost his medical license and served time in jail. For many fans, it offered a small sense of accountability, even if it could never undo what had already happened. The trial also forced a much wider conversation, one that went far beyond Michael Jackson himself. It raised uncomfortable questions about how far some doctors are willing to go when a wealthy, famous patient asks for something outside the bounds of normal medical practice. It raised questions about power, about the imbalance between a global superstar who can request almost anything and a physician who may feel pressure to say yes rather than risk losing the job. And it raised questions about isolation, about how someone surrounded by assistants, managers, security guards, and medical staff can still end up completely alone in the one moment when it mattered most. Looking back now, what strikes so many people about this story isn't just the tragedy of losing an icon. It's how preventable so much of it seems in hindsight. A man struggling with months of insomnia. A treatment plan built around a hospital-grade anesthetic used in a bedroom. A doctor stepping away at the worst possible moment. A chain of small decisions that, one after another, led to a devastating outcome that could have been stopped at almost any point along the way. Michael Jackson gave the world some of the most iconic music and performances in history. Thriller. Bad. Dangerous. Songs that still fill dance floors and stadiums today, decades after they were written. But behind the spotlight, behind the record sales and sold-out arenas, was a man quietly enduring pain, pressure, and isolation that very few people around him seemed willing to confront honestly until it was far too late. His story is a reminder of how deceiving fame can be from the outside looking in, how someone can be surrounded by an entire team of people and still be desperately, dangerously alone in the moments that matter most. It's a reminder that the pressure to perform, to be perfect, to never show weakness, can push even the most talented people in the world toward decisions that put their lives at risk. It's worth remembering, too, that this was a man who spent almost his entire life in front of an audience. He was performing professionally before most of us even started school, carrying the weight of his family's expectations, and later an entire industry's expectations, from an age when most children are still learning how to tie their shoes. Decades of being watched, judged, and picked apart in public can leave a mark that never fully goes away, no matter how much success follows. Maybe that's part of why, even at the height of his fame, he still seemed to be searching for something he never quite found, a place where he could simply exist without being on display. More than a decade after his passing, Michael Jackson's influence hasn't faded. His music still plays. His moves are still studied and imitated by dancers around the world. New generations discover him and fall in love with his artistry the same way their parents did. In many ways, he really did become immortal through his work, even though the man behind it left far too soon and in circumstances that still feel almost impossible to fully process. If this story moved you, if it made you see the King of Pop a little differently, let us know what stood out to you the most. And if you want more deep dives like this one, stay close, because there are more stories waiting to be told, stories about the people behind the legends, the moments the world never got to see until it was already too late.